It's hard for me to say when I thought of myself as an artist, when I discovered that that was the thing that I wanted to do more than anything else. I basically went to college and thought I would study art for fun, that I didn't decide that I would become an art major because that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I just wanted to do it right then. My studying art in college was a result of a whim that captured me, and then I got to the University of Michigan. So I very quickly, found myself in the company of kids who really knew what they were doing, and when I looked around and saw how well they could draw, because they developed the skill of drawing, I thought, well, I can't do that, because I didn't appreciate that it was actually something that you could acquire or learn. I believed that it was a gift, an innate thing, and so I thought, I better find something I can do, and because I'd been such a good model builder as a child, I sort of gravitated towards sculpture and making things with my hands. And so I did sculptures of things falling over, things crashing, ocean liners sinking in the water. I'm not sure exactly why that held my attention. I liked the idea of being able to freeze time. But the pieces that I made do suggest that something was going on. These all suggest that there's a little narrative involved. There's something before and after. When I graduated from Rhode Island School of Design, my habit as a young artist was to work all the time. So I said, I need to find something else to do at night, a hobby. And I thought, well, I've got a drawing table in my apartment, and I have pencils and I have paper. Maybe I'll just start drawing some pictures. And they were a little bit like the sculpture that I made. They presented peculiar things. There was something happening in the drawing that suggested a story, that there was a provocation in the pictures. People would look at it and say, well, what's going on there? And I liked that. I decided I would draw some more pictures, just do that during the daytime a little bit. A friend of mine who was involved in publishing saw these pictures, and he said, why don't you show it to my publisher? And I was not interested in doing that, but my wife, always a tireless advocate for me, said, well, I'll take these to the publishers. So she took a stack of drawings and went to some publishers, and they all had a very positive response because they saw in them, I guess, this kind of storytelling impulse on the part of the artist. So I started working on a story, and at the time I was interested in topiary gardens as drawing subject matter. And I started thinking about an adventure in a garden, and then I thought about a boy who has an adventure with a dog in a garden, because I was kind of interested in drawing dogs too. And so these elements started to come together. And then I thought, well, such a strange garden would be overseen by a strange person. And I wondered how the person who had the garden would feel about the dog in his garden. And so it just sort of coalesced kind of into a story called The Garden of Abdul Ghazazi. And I discovered that I had presented a premise, an idea. And the idea was that there are two kinds of magic that people confront in their lives. One is the stage magic, the magic of illusion that you see when you sit in a theater and watch somebody cut a woman in half. But the other is the real magic, the magic of miracles, the things that you can't account for. It's a little bit like, the Polar Express, which was an idea about taking a trip on a train, but became a story about something much more than that, a story about belief and the ability to recapture the specific kinds of belief you had as a child, a belief in the miraculous. The Mysteries of Harris Burdick, which is the collections of the drawings that I discovered of Burdick's and collected into the Mysteries of Harris Burdick, has an image of a house lifting off as if it's rocket-propelled. And what's happened is kids see the Burdick book and they're inspired to write stories based on these images, which is a lot of sort of the way I make some of my stories. And when I was working on Zathura, I realized that with a slight story manipulation, I actually could have made it a Burdick story, the house on Maple Street. When I draw pictures of places, I make them up because I have in my imagination, in the case of Zathura, this particular place. And you're trying to make something that looks absolutely real, but because it doesn't exist and you're just relying on your imagination, you end up making something that looks real but isn't. And it's a little bit more like a dream. And it's not really my intention to make it look spooky and menacing. I'm just trying to make it look right. As a visual artist, I've always been interested in what I think of as cognitive dissonance, and that's when you have two things close together that don't belong together, and you can't make sense of them. I like the idea of putting things together that are unexpected. And there's nothing odd about a picture of a kitchen, and there's nothing particularly strange about a picture of a couple of monkeys. But if you stick a couple of monkeys on the kitchen table, then you've got something that's more than the sum of its parts. So I like the idea of having this house quiet, still, and then I thought, well, there's children in it. They actually don't like the quiet and stillness and predictability of it because it's boring to them. And so I thought, well, what's the remedy for boredom? Well, the remedy for boredom is a game. I thought, well, they'll play this game, and this game will produce things that will make the house very strange indeed. I thought, I'm going to make a game that delivers everything it promises. You know, when it says there's a monsoon, there's going to be a monsoon. And it became Jumanji. The boys who play Zathura are introduced on the last page of Jumanji. They're introduced as Danny and Walter Budwing, and all we learn about them is that they don't finish what they begin. And that's a real sort of enticement for kids who read the book to wonder what happens to Danny and Walter, because they know not finishing Jumanji is bad news. And I didn't write that last page, you know, thinking that I would ever revisit Danny and Walter. And sometimes kids would send me Jumanji 2 stories and that sort of thing. And so as years passed, I became interested in what did happen to Danny and Walter Budwing.
Can we watch SpongeBob?
No.
You used to like it.
Times change.
Tartar sauce. I'm hungry.
So what do you want me to do about it?
Make me macaroni and cheese.
I don't know how.
I believe in being sort of, following the rules that you create for yourself, and I'm gonna do everything I can to make sure that this exactly fits the last page of Jumanji. I guess I sort of felt challenged by it, to see if I could come up with something like a sequel. I knew I could not do an interesting story simply by taking the game and putting it in Danny and Walter's hands. I wanted a new game. I had an old catalog published in like 1904 or 1905 as a reproduction of the Sears Roebuck catalog. And it had board games, which were quite popular then. It had board games in them. And I remember seeing that board games often had a game printed on both sides of the board, or sometimes two boards. And that would be an economy, because you could use all the same gizmos. You could use a spinner or dice or little markers, tokens. And so you get two games for not much more than the price of one game. So I was thinking, well, I've got Danny and Walter Budwing. I could make a completely new game just by shoving another board in there, and that's the game they would play. It conforms to something that artists often do, and that's variations on a theme. And if you look at painters, I mean, Monet, he painted some haystacks, and then he painted some haystacks again. They have augmented it quite successful, I think, because they've added things to it, but everything they've added is consistent with the things that only exist as suggestions or the small kind of like plot points that are in the book. But the character story that's in there, which is the thing that really is, I think, most successfully sort of augmented, is this conflict between the brothers.
Look what he did.
I was on the phone.
It was an accident.
You're such a baby.
I'm not a baby.
You break all my stuff.
When you see a fantasy that has so many impossible things happening, when you see a real human relationship intertwined with that story, it makes everything seem more gripping, more real. And so that little thing in the book, and it's only little because the book is so little, because it's still fairly important in the book. But that was sort of a seed that was planted that grew into the more complicated, tree that's the feature-length film script. And and then in terms of visually, I knew that when I was writing Zathura that there's this claustrophobia that takes place, because as soon as they start playing the game, the house is the world, because they can't go out. You know, every time I staged a scene and I had a window, I just loved, you know, picking up my ink bottle and just putting this pitch black in there with the little white stars, because that just was like, this is it. You can't go out here. And of course that translates very effectively to a cinematic idea. But the one that they got closest to matching is really one of the really most kind of satisfying scenes is when Danny goes up and opens the door. But there's something about not being able to see what's out there, and then the character opens the door and takes a look out, and then you get to see it too, and it's it's real satisfying. Since this is the third book of mine that's been turned into a film, I've come to sort of think of it in a slightly different way than I thought about it the first time, which was that, you know, books function as a kind of blueprint, and that the filmmaker is like a contractor and I'm the architect. And it's nothing like that at all, because principally the books that I make don't have enough information in them to actually be a blueprint for anything. It's that I provided inspiration to another storyteller. I can take credit for the germ of the idea, the seed of the idea. David Koepp and Jon Favreau see what I've done, and they're inspired by it. And they add their own artistic impulses, their own feelings, their own ideas about it, and it becomes something different. It's still got some of my DNA in it, but it's got theirs too. So I understand that when you give these things over, that you have to give them over without attaching a lot of strings. You have to have faith in the artistic instincts of the next person, of the screenwriter and ultimately the filmmaker. You have to let them go. So when I got to that point and realized now that what film credits should say, they should never say based on the book by. They should say inspired by the book. Because even with novels, I think that's a more accurate way of describing what's happening between the printed page and the filmmaker. It's inspiration. I'm happy to provide it.